The Machinist is a physical range job introduced in the first expansion of Final Fantasy XIV, Heavensward. Suited with a variety of guns, machinery, and a Gundam, this job has gone through the highest highs and the lowest lows over the years. Today I want to talk about the history of Machinist, its progression from Heavensward to Dawntrail, and how it went from one of the strongest picks to currently arguably the worst job in the game. This is the history of Machinist. Machinist was introduced to the world in 2014's FanFest in Tokyo, approximately 6 months before Heavensward's release. Shown as a gun-wielding job, Machinist's main weapon was the firearm, and used mechanical equipment such as attachments to the gun to modify it along with deployable turrets. Using these turrets, Machinist can perform a supportive role in the party as the turrets can attack enemies, debuff enemies, or buff allies. By using attachments, Machinist can transform his gun into something similar to a cannon. In this state, his attacks require a cast in return for giving him higher DPS. Before the job was released, some details about it was also discussed during the letter from the producer Live 21. Machinist's role is similar to Bard. However, the playstyle and awareness for the job will greatly differ. Their major speciality is to use a buff called Ammunition, and by using stacks of these, it'll add various additional effects to the weapon skills. A special note that they mention is the idea of reloading. By using this, you can reload up to 5 stacks of ammunition. Not only will you reload when you use up all the stacks, but you can also reload when not out of any ammunition to increase the damage efficiency. Additionally, there is also an action called Quick Reload, which will instantly load 1 ammunition for use in dire situations, so use these utilities to manage the amount of ammunition you have. It was an interesting concept, and pretty much completely different to the Machinist that we have now. When Heavensward released, physical ranged as a role kind of went through an identity change in that they gained a lot more damage as a trade-off to having a form. For Machinists, this was done with the previously mentioned gun attachments, Gauss Barrel. The idea was to keep uptime on this stance as best as possible, since when you had to move, you had to either use your skills cleverly to keep uptime or unattach. This meant that knowledge of the fight was incredibly valuable. Weapon skills worked a bit differently. Nowadays, Machinist rotation is static, meaning that there's no percentage chance procs in the kit. On release, the standard 1-2-3 combo did have percentage chances. Shot 1 gave a 50% chance to boost Shot 2 and another 50% to boost Shot 3. And once more, these skills had different interactions with your cast stance and ammunitions. When you had Gauss Barrel attached, Shot 1 would make Shot 2 have no cast time, and similar from 2 to 3. By using ammunition, you could guarantee that the percentage chance is procced. Speaking of ammunition, let's cover that in a bit more detail. Machinist could have a max of 5 ammunition loaded at once. You reloaded these by using either Reload or Quick Reload. Reload was an instant cast with a 60-second cooldown that fully loads your firearm with 5 ammo. Every time a weapon skill was used, it would consume 1 ammo to deal a bit of extra damage and guarantee that their chance procs. Quick Reload only loaded 1 ammo but had a 40-second cooldown and also restored your TP, which was the melee's equivalent of mana. So the idea was to use ammunition and the Gauss Barrel attachment in a way that would maximize the number of instant casts you could do, whilst also having sufficient resources for burst phases and movement adjustments for mechanics. This management becomes very important, as becomes evident when we take a look at old Wildfire, which was very different. As opposed to the Wildfire now, which increases a set amount of potency every weapon skill you land in the duration, old Wildfire stored a flat 25% of your damage dealt over 15 seconds, and then deals it again at the end of the duration. For 1, it didn't proc on weapon skills, and 2, it didn't have a limit on how much damage it would do, unlike the Wildfire now, which stops at 1440 potency. So considering you wanted to fit all your damage into the Wildfire window whilst also managing resources so you could freely move during mechanics and get the most out of your instant casts, it was quite difficult to do. On top of this, you had a dot to manage in the form of Lead Shot, and mini trick attack in the form of Hot Shot, and turrets, which are also vastly different to now. Instead of having 1 turret like now, Machinists in Heavensward had 2, Rook and Bishop auto turrets. Rooks were used for single target, and Bishops were used for AoE. It didn't cost any bar because bars were only introduced in Stormblood, so it was just an OGCD on 10 seconds. You could use Hypercharge to increase the potency of the turrets for some time and add additional effects on hit. Rooks increase the target's physical damage taken, and Bishops magical. The part I find most interesting though was that you could promote your turret to turn them into a supportive role. Promotion disables the turret's attack mode and will create a 20 yard radius where it will restore either TP or MP depending on what turret you used of whoever was in that range. This was Machinist's supportive aspect, as they had mentioned in the FanFest. Lastly, it's time to mention the cross-class actions, which were the skills that you basically took from other classes that you had leveled. For Machinist, it was quite simple. Raging Strikes, Hawk's Eye, Quelling Strikes, Blood for Blood, and Invigorate. There wasn't really much variety here. Now, it's funny, I mentioned all this about having weapon cast times due to the application of Gauss Barrel which increased your damage dealt, but this wasn't actually true. You didn't deal more damage with Gauss Barrel, because when you were in caster stance, you lost your auto attacks, and it was the general consensus that losing auto attacks wasn't worth the 20% extra damage you were getting with Gauss Barrel attached on top of limiting your mobility. So players would often put the barrel on just to hit Gauss Round and Ricochet since those skills required the barrel, and then take it back off. Square Enix was quite heavily criticized for this, but the reason was that due to working on the release of Ninja in A Realm Reborn, and having to make 3 additional jobs for Heavensward's release, their team was taxed very heavily and had issues running tests before fully releasing the job. Machinist on 3.0 release was considered very weak and underpowered, and so in the lifespan of Heavensward it got some decent buffs that made it pretty much part of every raid comp. 1. The Rook auto turret's damage got buffed by 20, which was quite nice. 2. Quick Reload's cooldown was reduced so you could get more ammunition. But the most significant change by far was the Gauss Barrel, to which they just gave an extra 10% damage. Machinist was strong not only because of the job itself, but rather its synergy with other jobs like Dragoon, Bard, and Ninja at the same time. Dragoon's Disembowel applying a piercing debuff on hit which made ranged jobs deal more damage, Bard's providing buffs to the party, and Ninja, you already know why Ninja was good. By 3.2, people were playing Machinist a lot more and it became a staple in almost every raid party. Machinist got a big rework. The biggest change was again the Gauss Barrel, and by extension the bar they added to Machinist, the overheat gauge. Having to cast your weapon skills to deal more damage was one of the most complained things about ranged jobs in Heavensward, and so after experimenting with this idea for one expansion, they decided to remove it. Now was an attachment that didn't limit your mobility, but only dealt 5% more damage. They added a unique interaction in the form of the overheat gauge, where whilst the barrel was equipped, different weapon skills would build different amounts of heat gauge. Once the heat gauge reached 100, your weapon then gets overheated, giving you a 10% damage increase for 10 seconds, but then forcibly removing the barrel for 10 seconds afterwards. This mechanic turned a lot of people away from Machinist. It went from one of the most popular jobs at the end of Heavensward to one of the most underrepresented at the start of Stormblood. The job was still good, but being forced to take off the barrel for 10 seconds just didn't mesh well with the majority of Machinist players. Of course, this 10% damage buff overheat mechanic didn't make up for the 25% damage loss of Gauss Barrel, so they also buffed the numbers on Machinist's other weapon skills like the standard 1-2-3 combo. The ammunition mechanic was changed so that you could only have at max 3 ammunition at a time, and so reload was changed to reload 3, but instead of being a 60-second cooldown, it was reduced to 30. So you would get 1 more ammo per minute, but less in burst windows. Wildfire's duration was reduced to 10 seconds, but was now available every 60 seconds rather than 90. The turrets were changed so that in Hypercharge, both turrets gave an effect of increasing the target's damage taken by 5%. So no longer were you forced to choose between physical or magical damage, although players pretty much always used the Rook for single target in raids, but regardless, it was a nice change. Moving on to the new skills, seeming as Machinist got this new fancy heat gauge, it would make sense that a lot of them would interact with it. A big example of this was cooldown, a skill you unlocked at 62 which delivered varying potencies depending on your current heat gauge. The skill also reduced your heat gauge by 25, which made it useful for adjusting your heat gauge to match with burst windows. If you were going to overcap on heat before burst, you could use cooldown to reduce the bar. Another skill that allowed you to control your heat gauge was Barrel Stabilizer at 66. This skill set your heat gauge to 50, meaning that you can both increase or decrease your heat depending on what you wanted, but most of the time you would just use it to increase. Moving on to the turrets, you also now had a skill that essentially sacrifices your turret for 30 seconds to deal 400 potency every 2 minutes. This was pretty underwhelming since 400 potency wasn't a lot compared to the drawback of losing your turret for 30 seconds. Even using it at a good time, like at the end of your hypercharge window but still within buffs, felt mediocre. Flamethrower was introduced and, believe it or not, it was actually quite useful. Not for the potency of the move itself, but rather to build heat gauge. This move gave the most amount of heat gauge in a single tick and was an OGCD, so players would use Flamethrower to force going into overheat before burst. You'd also start the fight using Flamethrower for 5 ticks to build a massive amount of heat before casting your first GCD to interrupt it. This was very clunky and generally inconsistent because you depended on server ticks for your gauge. If you ended Flamethrower one tick early, then your heat and cooldown rotational alignment would get thrown off, making it not a great time. So the general game plan was to dance around 50 to 95 heat gauge, as maintaining a high heat gauge lets your 1-2-3 combo deal more damage. And when the burst window came, you used Flamethrower to force overheat to give yourself the damage buff from overheating. There was a very big problem at this point though. It wasn't actually clear whether Square Enix wanted Machinist to overheat intentionally or not. The overheat mechanic was seemingly designed as a penalty, and the damage buff acted as consolation for messing up your heat. But players discovered that the 10% gain from overheating during burst windows gave just slightly more potency, and so the playstyle of intentional overheats emerged. This playstyle was high risk low reward though, since the damage gain was marginal, but if you messed it up, you were not in for a good time. This was part of the reason why Machinist was less popular around this time, because it was a niche and intimidating job. Eventually, after a time of confusion and debates on whether overheating was actually worth it, Square Enix embraced the playstyle and buffed the overheat damage to 20%, making it the definitive way to play. And in the same patch, they made Flamethrower give a lot more heat per tick. In fact, it would end up giving 20 per tick, allowing you to fully overheat your gauge with 5 ticks at the start of the fight. The turret sacrificing skill also buffed to 800 potency, which needed to happen since 400 potency was just not enough to justify the drawback. In the early lifespan of Stormblood, Final Fantasy XIV's first ultimate, the Unending Coil of Bahamut, was introduced. Machinist at this point was very strong, boasting high damage and good utility, and was a desirable job in meta comps. Being able to provide basically a ranged version of Trick Attack, increasing physical damage dealt to the enemy by 8% at this point, was a big deal. And the effect had just been buffed from 30 seconds to 60 seconds. Shortly after Ukob came Uwu, the weapon's refrain, which Machinist also performed quite well in. Machinist in Stormblood was good, but in terms of design and difficulty, it was a nightmare. All of its damage was fit into the tight overheat window, and so good ping became increasingly more important. Messing up was extremely punishing, and their utility was there, but not that insane. Being a good Machinist was hard, and the reward was that your damage would be high as well, but mess it up and it would be garbage. Moving into the Shadowbringers era, Machinist would see yet another complete overhaul of its kit, which made it a lot more simpler and accessible. And with this new era of Machinist, do we start to see the rising importance of ping with this job. Ping was already quite an important factor before Shadowbringers with the tight burst window of overheating and wildfire, but this rework made the stigma even more popular. Of course, there were players who played Machinist with mid or high ping, but the most common sentiment was that to play this job well and seamlessly, you had to have low ping. A lot of previous Machinist players were quite pessimistic moving into Shadowbringers because Wildfire had been a design disaster for so long, yet they didn't touch the skill. To start off the changes, Ghost Barrel got completely removed. No longer did you have a quote-unquote stance you could turn on and off to affect your abilities, all of that got deleted. The ammunition mechanic also got removed, and hence the basic 1, 2, 3 and any of the other skills that had effects depending on ammunition got changed. You had a lot less things to manage as they essentially took out 2 of Machinist's resources. You no longer had to worry about accidentally or intentionally overheating since that mechanic was changed too. Your basic 1, 2, 3 combo now just builds heat gauge, with the finisher now building a separate battery gauge as well. Other skills like Hotshot were also changed to add battery gauge, but for this skill specifically, they removed the mini trick attack effect. Ghost Round, which was just an OGCD you could press before Ghost Barrel, now had 3 charges with a 30-second cooldown. Similarly, Ricochet also got 3 charges. Interestingly though, although these skills are similar in their potency and cooldowns, these didn't share the same cooldown since they were entirely different skills. Hypercharge's change was important as it was pretty much designed to link with 2 other skills and was also largely part of why this job was considered ping on friendly to higher ping players. Hypercharge costs 50 gauge and increases the potency of single target weapon skills by 20. This was used in conjunction with Heat Blast, which is a single target weapon skill of 1.5 second GCD that delivers an attack with a potency of 200, but most importantly reduces the cooldown of both Ghost Round and Ricochet by 15 seconds. So when you activate Hypercharge, you'd fire Heat Blast on a very short GCD, which allows you to weave a Ghost Round or Ricochet OGCD between Heat Blasts. And on that note, let's talk about Wildfire, the final piece of the puzzle. Wildfire got completely reworked to complement Hypercharge and Heat Blast, as now it was a debuff you'd apply to the target that deals damage when the duration expires. The potency of this skill is increased by 200 for each of your weapon skills landed. So for burst windows, you would use Hypercharge and apply Wildfire, then spam Heat Blast while weaving one OGCD between each Heat Blast. This was the main reason why ping was important for this job. Due to the 1.5 second GCD of Heat Blast and the need to weave an OGCD between each one, if you had high ping, then it was very likely that you would clip part of your GCD and hence lose out on a Heat Blast. The turrets got changed too. Instead of having a single target turret and an AoE turret, now you only had the single target. You used 50 battery gauge to send this turret out, and if you had any excess gauge left, it would consume that gauge to increase the duration that it was out for. Before the duration ends however, it would automatically perform a finisher attack like Rook Overdrive, now called Rook Overload. Machinist supportive capabilities with his turrets got removed with this expansion too. The MP and TP generation field got removed, and TP itself actually got removed in Shadowbringers. Machinist got a new way to use their Hypercharge for AoE damage, Auto Crossbow. This skill is certainly a skill. The major gripe pretty much everyone had with this skill at the time of release, and it's become even worse now, is that although it shares similar properties to Heat Blast with its 1.5 second GCD and only being able to be performed during Hypercharge, is that it was missing one thing. It doesn't reduce the cooldown of Ghost Barrel and Ricochet. There's no reason why it shouldn't be the case. This design just doesn't make sense and will hurt the job pretty badly in the future, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Drill was a new skill that Machinist got that did a good amount of damage with a low cooldown. This shared a recast timer with Bioblaster, which was a very underwhelming AoE dot, so it was pretty much never used. Barrel Stabilizer increased heat by 50 instead of setting your heat to 50, and Flamethrower became pretty much a useless skill. It didn't increase heat gauge anymore, and the damage it did was never really worth it over using your traditional AoE combo. The only time it was even remotely useful was in downtime of a fight. Before the boss reappears, you could spray Flamethrower in its general direction, hoping for one tick before pressing your GCD to add a very minor damage increase. Again, this relied on server ticks, so it wasn't even consistent either. Hotshot at level 76 changes to Air Anchor, which does the same thing, but just does more damage, and similarly with Rook Auto Turret, at level 80 it becomes Automaton Queen, which is just a Gundam. Yeah, it's pretty cool. A lot of previous skills like Reload, Quick Reload, Heartbreak were removed, including Dismantle, which was one of two party util skills that Machinists had. This felt pretty bad, as Machinist was already the selfish DPS out of the range. I mean, you're competing with Bard and Dancer, both of which have amazing utility. Now the only party skill that Machinist had was Tactician every 2 minutes. All the way throughout Shadowbringers, Machinist didn't really see a change in its playstyle. In fact, all the changes that were done to it were just potency changes. The job was in a good state, and although some players missed the ammunition mechanic, most players loved the rework. Players with high ping did beg Square Enix to change the way Machinist's burst window worked due to the clipping issue I mentioned before, but they didn't really do anything with that. Overall, Square Enix established their vision with Machinist going into the future, and they executed it pretty well, but unfortunately some players were simply ping gated from the job. The Epic of Alexander was added in patch 5.11, and Machinist performed pretty poorly. The job's damage just wasn't there in the fight, being the least damaging job in the fight pretty much across all percentiles. Going into Endwalker, a lot of Machinist potencies were tuned down. In fact, pretty much all of Machinist's skills were nerfed, some of them by quite a lot, like Drill went from 700 to 550, and the final attack for the Queen went from 800 to 650. Though the Queen specifically got compensation as they added a second finisher attack, Crown Collider, the other skills weren't exactly compensated as much. Machinist got two new skills, Scattergun, which was an upgrade to your basic AoE ability, and Chainsaw, which is an AoE attack that does 550 potency to the target, and a lot less for surrounding enemies. This also increased the battery gauge by 20. This battery gauge increase was actually a very nice addition, as now you could get a Queen in your opener, and it was just a very useful skill every minute to build up your gauge. At this point in the job's lifespan, another problem with the design was emerging, that being Machinist's AoE skills, or rather the lack thereof. Almost all of the skills that Machinists used were only single target. Your basic 1-2-3 combo was obviously single target, Wildfire was single target, the Queen was single target, Hypercharge, Drill, Air Anchor, Ghost Round, all of those were only used for single target. Now, there were some skills that had overlap, meaning that it would deal big damage to a single target, but also deal some damage to surrounding ones like Chainsaw and Ricochet. But apart from these, Machinist's AoE rotation sucked. Auto Crossbow was just bad because it still didn't reduce the cooldown of your OGCDs and was only a potency increase over Ghost Round when there were more than 6 targets. You actually lost damage by doing an AoE move rather than a single target move if there were 5 targets. Bioblaster wasn't useful, and Flamethrower also wasn't useful since you'd rather just do your basic AoE combo. Which leaves us with nothing. No skills apart from your basic 1-2 combo. The reason why this became a big issue wasn't inherently because of having no AoE skills, but rather that you couldn't spend your battery gauge on any AoE. The battery gauge was linked only to the Queen, and the Queen was only single target, so it felt terrible if you capped on battery and had to AoE. Due to the potency nerfs, Machinist wasn't doing so hot at the start of Endwalker. For being the selfish DPS that it is, with the only party util being Tactician, although its cooldown got reduced from 2 minutes to 90 seconds, the job just wasn't pumping nearly enough damage. In fact, the other ranged jobs, Bard and Dancer, were doing more damage than Machinist, and needless to say, had way more party util. Now, of course, this wasn't enough to make people lock positions or anything close to it. It was still a viable job that could clear any content. This really only mattered for week 1 clears, but it felt bad regardless. In patch 6.11, FF14's 4th ultimate Dragon Song's Reprise got added, and Machinist was again doing quite poorly. To sum it up, it pretty much just didn't deal enough damage to justify bringing a Machinist over a Bard or a Dancer. In fact, on FF logs, Machinist was again dealing the least damage behind Bard and Dancer, which is crazy because the other jobs also offered way more party util. Bard had Nature's Min, or Mine, or however you pronounce that, which when paired with Skull's Protraction made Critlow an absolutely insane sustain skill. Dancer had Curing Waltz, which was very strong and could act as a safety net for if a healer died, or to potentially save Gigaflare casts in P7. It also had Improv and Shield Samba. In Phase 5's Death of the Heavens, even if you had 2 DPS stats, if you had a White Mage's Ass Eyes, and a Dancer who banks tech stat for prog, you could still beat the DPS check with 6 people. You could not do this with a Machinist. Furthermore, DSR's design itself was disadvantageous for Machinists since it's a gauge-based job. In the later half of Endwalker, Machinist got a big change to a core skill, Hypercharge. Now, Hypercharge granted 5 stacks of a buff called Overheat, and each stack allows you to use Heat Blast or Crossbow. Finally, after years of complaint, they turned Hypercharge into a stack-based ability rather than time-based. The stacks themselves had a timer of 10 seconds, so you would still have to use all the Heat Blast in a short amount of time, but it was much more manageable than it previously was. Along with this change, Machinist got a ton of overall buffs. Wildfire, that was previously at 150 potency per weapon skill, got buffed to 240. Drill, Air Anchor, Chainsaw got buffed by around 50 potency, and another huge change was the Queen. The Queen's duration used to depend on the battery gauge you had when you called it in, but this patch made it so that it always lasted 12 seconds, but it just did more damage if you had more gauge. These buffs were great and gave Machinist some of the support it needed in higher level content. Dismantle was also added back after almost 4 years of being removed. It was a good time to add it back because around the same patch in 6.3, the Omega Protocol was added, and it was extremely useful in that fight. Speaking of top, Machinist was a great pick in that due to the buffs and also because of debuff soup. The way the fight is designed makes it so that depending on your comp, you could potentially overcap on the amount of buffs you could have. Obviously, this was not ideal, and so a good amount of groups ran more ADPS focused comps, which included Machinist. Fast forward to Dawntrail, where Machinist was again competing for the bottom 2 spots in terms of damage, especially in the upcoming ultimate. Machinist's playstyle didn't really change much in this expansion, just getting a few changes that added on to their previous gameplay loop. Both Ghost Round and Ricochet got upgraded to Double Check and Checkmate, both of which did the exact same thing. 170 potency to the target and reduced for surrounding targets, both of them with 3 charges. they could remove one of the skills and make the other one 6 charges, and it wouldn't do anything at all apart from maybe some weaving in the 2 minutes. As an extension to Chainsaw, they got Excavator, which was yet another 600 potency damage skill that did less damage to surrounding enemies and boosted battery gauge by 20. This helped in the opener as well, since more battery gauge meant that you could get a stronger bot. Lastly, Full Metal Field, which was a guaranteed crit direct hit of 900 potency to the target and reduced for surrounding. Square Enix doubled down on Machinist's selfish playstyle, which was fine. Machinist had been considered the selfish range DPS since the removal of Dismantle and the supportive capabilities of the turrets way back. But there was also a problem with this design that loomed over Machinist for years up to this point, and that is mobility tax. So because Machinist was a ranged job, that meant it had the freedom of movement. It could move anywhere and still be able to hit the boss without casts. This trait is obviously shared with the other Fizz range jobs. Square Enix balances this by reducing their damage when compared to melee jobs. However, this clashes with the idea of being a selfish DPS. On one side, Machinist needs to deal more damage than the other ranged DPS since it offers less party util, but on the other hand, it was getting mobility taxed. When compared to the other selfish jobs like Samurai and Black Mage, Machinist did a lot less damage in respect to the other jobs in their role. Features Rewritten, or Through, was released in patch 7.11, and Machinist wildly underperformed in this fight. Part of the reason was because, like mentioned before, it just didn't have the damage to keep up with the other ranged jobs. But a large portion was also because the fight had an immense amount of downtime. Jobs like Machinist and Viper, which required gauge but didn't have any way to generate it during downtime, was hurt very badly, whereas jobs that took advantage of this downtime, most notably by far Pictomancer, dominated in this fight. And unfortunately, Machinist did the least amount of damage in this fight by an absurd amount. Shortly after Through came the second raid tier of Dawn Trail, and I'm going to mention this specifically because in this tier, Square Enix brought back the idea of ads in Savage fights, something that we hadn't seen for a very long time. And this is where Machinist's clunky and unintuitive AoE rotation comes into play. At this point, which I guess is current, Auto Crossbow still doesn't reduce the cooldown of Machinist OGCDs. Wildfire and Air Anchor still isn't AoE. Machinists still can't spend their battery gauge on any form of AoE. In the patch that they dropped this tier, Machinist AoE skills got their potency buffed, but the holes in the gameplay still remained. Most notably in M6S, which has a very notorious ads phase, Machinist could only use their auto crossbow skill, which is designed to be an AoE skill if there were 6 or more targets like mentioned before. Any less and it was a DPS loss. You should instead use the single target skill Heat Blast in order to reduce the cooldowns of Double Check and Checkmate so that you can weave those. Furthermore, the 2-minute window was in the middle of this ads phase, and since Wildfire was an AoE, you would have to swap target to the boss to apply Wildfire, then use your hypercharge stacks on the boss before swapping to the ads, losing out on a bunch of damage on the ads. Okay, I think I've yapped enough. Over the years, Machinist has gone through being one of the strongest jobs in the game, being part of almost every party from late Heavensward to Stormblood, to being arguably the weakest job in the game post Endwalker. The job's playstyle completely changed a total of 3 times throughout the expansions, so I thought it would be interesting to explore the history of this job. I hope this video was entertaining and informative, and thanks for watching.